Hello and welcome to Season 9, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Orestes Brownson's The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny. This time talking about Chapter 2 of this book, which is really just about what government is. Very short chapter, as I think a lot of these will be. It was only a few pages long, but I thought really good stuff, even just in these. I think it was 6 pages.
Why?
Is what it was.
Why do you think it's good stuff?
Because I think it's a very good explanation of what things are and the necessity of government. Because essentially his argument is saying that government is not just a necessary evil, as some people think it is, but that it's something that we as humans, as social beings, need, because we need to be in a society with one another, and so there needs to be some form of government sort of regulating that society.
Do you agree?
I do. Do you not?
I don't know. I've been so focused for so many years on thinking that it is a necessary evil. Mm-hmm. But he makes a pretty decent case.
Because I think it's very, very easy for it to become an evil thing.
And he talks about that.
Yeah. But I think government as an entity itself does not have to inherently be evil.
Yeah. You know, and I guess it's kind of funny. I look at local government different than I look at the federal government, because I see, of course, I'm a city attorney, so I see a lot of the good that we can do in a community with the local government, and it's necessary. For instance, I had a trial docket today. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, I was called, what do you say? Corrupt.
You're corrupt.
I was called corrupt
Wow.
by a defendant.
Huh.
I'm not exactly sure why.
Interesting.
I think
maybe he listened to the podcast.
Well, no, I know he hates me, but I was a little befuddled by the allegation of corruption.
Yeah.
Because
what was the context?
He's being charged with a crime.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense, I guess.
Well, I'm prosecuting him,
Yes.
and so I don't know if I want to tell a long story or short story. I'll tell the short story.
Okay.
He's a difficult person, and he's one of these people that likes to create a crisis and then claim he's the victim of the mess that he has created.
Naturally.
But I was a little surprised by the comment that I'm corrupt. I was kind of befuddled by it. And meanwhile, both the bailiff and the judge were yelling at him to shut up and get out of the courtroom. I had a bench trial. Speaking of, like, local government can be, of course, it can be perceived like he doesn't perceive. He's just name calling.
Yes.
But I had a peace disturbance trial today, which you think it's this muni court, so it's not an important case. But it was important to the two people involved, which are neighbors.
Yes.
Because for some reason, this one neighbor thinks it's a good idea to work on his drag race car.
Oh.
All hours of the day and into the evening, which involves him tuning it up, which means he's adjusting like the fuel flow into it.
So very, very loud.
Yes. And in fact,
because I've been to drag races, and it's a lot.
It's not a funny car,
Yeah.
So it's like a regular car, but with like no muffler, I mean,
okay.
but it's juiced up, and I don't know all the details of the car, but the officer actually chuckled a little bit. But I had him to describe it. He says, "Yeah, if it has a muffler, it would be news to me." It was so loud that you could hear it far, far away. And of course, they call the police, and the police officer goes, "Hey, your neighbor just wants you to stop for the night.
Yeah,
Do you mind just not doing that for the rest of the night, like at 9:00 in February? So it's been dark for like 3 hours or 4 hours." And he's like, there's no time limit on peace disturbance. I said I'd do 10:00. I'm going to do it till 10:00. The officer says, like, just stop doing it. Right? So he says, no. And so the officer contacts the victim, which is like his neighbor. And as he's filling out the citation, this idiot's over there, just being a jerk. And so he was found guilty.
Naturally, I would imagine.
Well, and I don't know why these people have trials. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to have a trial and you represent yourself, don't say, I don't want to testify and I have no evidence. Mm-hmm. That's usually a bad sign. And then, of course, in closing argument, say all the things that you would have said if it were under oath, because then you're going to hear an objection that's not in evidence. Sustained. Move on. And it's just a series of objections in a befuddled defendant not even knowing. Well, you can't make a closing argument based upon things that are not in evidence.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Interesting.
So he got a $400 fine in court costs, and he'll be back.
Yeah.
So, that's not that much. I'll pay that today. Okay. $400 just to be an FU to the neighbors. Yes. But my point is, we need the government to mediate those disputes, because this guy is not going to stop unless the court system punishes him. We don't want to lock him up necessarily, but we have to, in a civil society, they would just be, somebody would just go over there and say, hey, can you stop? And a reasonable person would stop, but some people won't.
Yeah.
And so we need to have some sort of government authority, not, like I said, lock him up and throw away the key, but it's going to be so expensive that he won't be able to buy fuel, if he keeps doing it. But it's just jerk neighbor cases. Yeah. So local government, of course, some people would say, well, you're in local government, so you don't see it as corrupt. But I mean, it can be bad. You can have heavy-handed local government, and all of them seem to have an insatiable desire for tax money, especially lately. Or maybe I'm just getting older. I'm like, what do you need all these tax increases for? Because you can have a cemetery tax, you can have a band tax, you can have the general tax, for the running of the city. You can have a special tax for law enforcement. You have a tax for fire service, for ambulance services. Of course, you got the school taxes. We have a 911 tax. We have a health board tax. We have a park tax. We have,
that's a lot of taxes.
There are so many taxes, and they're insatiable.
Yeah.
I don't understand that, because it used to be, when I started out in this business, that you'd hear some dissenting voices say, you know what, we could put that money to good use, but maybe we shouldn't, keep raising the taxes. Yeah. I don't hear that from anybody.
Interesting.
Anymore. And I'm in a conservative area.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the book a little bit. I think yes. Tangentially.
Tangentially is a direct relation to what he's saying about how government can be beneficial and benevolent.
Yes, exactly.
Which you don't hear. Have you heard any other popular commentator in the last 5 years say that the government can be beneficial to us?
Not on the right. I think that's a viewpoint more often, held by the left. Generally speaking. I know there's some leftists.
Unless the MAGA people get in charge.
Yes, there's some leftists that are, communists or anarchists or whatever you want to call them, who want to fundamentally change the government, think our current system is horrible. But I think there's a lot of them that think the government is often the best way to go about helping people, rather than private charity or things like that. They think that the government is generally a force for good and needs to help people.
Yeah,
but I think on the right, I think so many people are, government needs to be very small, government needs to be so restricted, because if it gets too big, it's a horrible evil. And I don't think that's necessarily out of step with Brownson. I think he would also be opposed to the huge government we have now. But let's see what he actually has to say. I really like this first paragraph where he says there's kind of 3 parts of someone's life, and they all have to do with our relation with other things.
Yes.
Man is a dependent being and neither does nor can suffice for himself. And so essentially what he says is there's one thing, which is the communion with God through creation. Incarnation is religion, distinctively taken, which binds man to God as his first cause. That's one of the 3 parts of life. Is religion is very important. And then society, that's the relationship of man with other men.
Yes.
And then property is man with nature, man with his belongings and stuff like that. The 3 things that you depend on. And I think that's
the way he
great
describes the property one, I've not heard before, where he says communion through the material world with God is expressed by the word property. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it, which I have not before.
Yeah. Well, because I think it kind of goes back to the idea of
we're stewards.
Yeah, we're stewards of creation.
Have.
We need to use creation and have possession over it to some degree, so that we can, better our relationship with God and other people.
Yes.
But we're dependent on that creation. We're dependent on the things in the world, the material, physical things.
Yes.
It's a very interesting description. I think he's right, but then, of course, he just moves on really past religion and property a little bit, because the main thing he wants to talk about is society.
Well, yeah, because society is the basis for government, which is the title of the chapter.
Yes.
So he's the whole point is to talk about government, not necessarily religion. But the way he infuses it with some sort of relationship with God is interesting. And he's, we've all heard, where men is a social creature, just like bees or ants or whatever, and we're going to have a society. But I thought he put it in a really interesting way.
Because it's all framed in connection with communion with God.
Yes.
That's everything. Religion is that direct communion with God, and then society is communion with God through other people, and then property is communion with God through created things.
I'm with him so far.
Yeah,
I like it.
I agree.
I agree.
I
I like how he's writing. It's very compact. It's short pages, but it's like, gosh, it's really a dense philosophical description of the nature of government.
Yeah.
I thought.
Yeah. And he gives a very short description. He says, why it's necessary, because everywhere you go, you will see people living with people. Society is a necessary thing. You can't just exist apart from society. Humans just do not do that. And therefore, there has to be something that governs the society. And that is what government is.
Yes. Something
that governs this communion with people. And he says, as society is a necessity of man's nature, so is government a necessity of society. I mean, I think that's very true.
And I thought his point about even if there had not been the fall, the original sin, which is getting a lot of currency lately. Like Josh Hawley had that book about manhood, which is a lot of it had to do with the fall and Adam and Eve and all that
absolutely.
stuff. And so it's getting a lot of currency. But this author makes the point that even if there was not the fall, even if we were not sinners, we would still have government. We would still need government, which I never heard that argument before. Have you?
I've heard it vaguely in very, very Catholic circles, because the argument that he takes is essentially, pre-fall, you have Adam and Eve, and that is somewhat a form of government. That is the first type of society, is the family. And you're going to have one governing the other. Otherwise, it's just two individuals who are just kind of doing whatever they want. There has to be one who's somewhat in charge, is what his argument is. And of course, Adam was placed sort of in government, I guess, over Eve and then over their children. They didn't have the children until after the fall.
I've heard more often an argument like if we were not sinners, it'd be more like, we'd all just agree to do the right thing, like communists.
Yes.
But his the way he explains it, I thought was I'm gonna have to ruminate on this one a lot more, because he's saying even if we didn't have that, we're all pure people. Like heaven has to be governed. Like there's some sort of hierarchy there or some sort of order, because we're these social creatures, which I had not really entertained before, which I thought was fascinating.
And I really like this sentence here, which I kind of alluded to before, where he says, if you didn't have society, if you didn't have a government, he says, of Adam and Eve, they would be simply two individuals of different sexes, and the family would fail for the want of unity. Because if you don't have a governing structure, it's not really a thing at all. It's just two separate things that aren't combined in some way. You have to have a government of the family, and then he says, then families become tribes become, civilizations, things like that. And everywhere you look throughout the entire world, you can see that there is some form of government, some form of very clear government.
As he says,
there.
we've never found you'll never find a savage tribe, however low or degraded, that does not assert itself somewhere. And the father or the elders, some sort of set of government.
The faint outlines of government.
What are your thoughts? It's a dangerous question, so be careful how you answer it. What are your thoughts about like the more traditional view of marriage and family, where like the male is to be the leader?
What do you mean specifically?
I just asked. That was a pretty specific question.
I think that's just broadly what are my thoughts. Like, what do you mean?
What do you mean? Do you agree with that? That the man is the leader of the family?
I would say so. I think that's what you typically see throughout society everywhere.
Isn't that just the patriarchy? I could see the wisdom of that, but then I also see a lot of really dysfunctional men.
Yeah.
And like the guy that called me corrupt, I had occasion to meet him and his wife and his stepson.
Oh, good.
Who called me an a-hole in the courtroom on a different proceeding. Anyway, it's a long story. But I was thinking, that woman should just tell him to shut up, and he ought to just do whatever she says. He will never do that. But she had 10 times more sense than he did about everything. Yeah. And so I don't know if I agree.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I think a lot of people mischaracterize, the very traditional, the Catholic position, really, of like the authority of the man as being very degrading towards women and assuming that women can't do anything. But in reality, they're both dependent on the other.
Oh, for sure.
Just in different ways. But I think a lot of people assume that it's just the man does whatever he wants and the wife just has to acquiesce, and that's just not really what that relationship is. They both rely on each other fundamentally. Otherwise, there would be no marriage or no union, no relationship at all.
I kind of view it, maybe it's more personal, but kind of like a decider of the last resort under some circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's like somebody has to be able to put their foot down and say, not this time. Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I guess every relationship's different, but I think there needs to be a certain amount of agreement on the vast majority of decisions and a delegation of different duties, whatever those would be, or primary responsibility. But I'm a little uncomfortable with just like the man is the person in charge. Yeah. Although I would agree that is the best situation when I'm involved.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly, anyway, exactly.
But he's definitely doesn't really belabor that, but he mentions it. The Adam would be the decider, or the head of that small two-person government, I guess you'd say.
And then he goes on here at the top of page 13. I thought this was really interesting. He's talking about government, of course. He says, next after religion, it is man's greatest good, and even religion without it can only do a small portion of her work. Yeah. And so he's not even saying, like, it's kind of a good thing. It's not that it's not just a bad thing, but he's also saying, no, this is a very, very good thing that humans do, and it should be a very good thing, and we shouldn't just look at it as a necessary evil. That's where he talks about. He says, they wrong it who call it a necessary evil. It is a great good, and instead of being distrusted, hated, or resisted, except in its abuses, it should be loved, respected, obeyed, and if need be, defended at the cost of all earthly goods and even of life itself.
Yes. I'm so down on the big government. It's hard for me to accept this, but I think he's in very real ways right about that, though.
Well, it's especially, I think, true because, he's writing in 1865. He's just seen the Civil War and all the terrors, that happened during that.
Isn't it almost unbelievable that he's a supporter of the government under those circumstances?
I mean, because I think he's seeing what is a lack of government fundamentally with, secession and things like that, deciding that we don't need to respect this union, this government that should be a good thing, and saying we can do whatever we want. And so then I think that's what he sees as someone who supports the union as the argument against that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I see it as like somebody trying to split off and form their own government. But okay.
But
that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
But he says, of course, the nature or essence of government is to govern. That is what its job is. And if it has not the ability to govern and governs not, maybe an agency. So there's other things that are out there that aren't quite government. So he's trying to get to the question of what exactly is a government. And he says, it's not, a totalitarian thing. He says, if it is a mere machine for making prevail the will of one man, of a certain number of men, or even of the community, it may be very effective, sometimes for good, sometimes for evil, oftenest for evil. But government in the proper sense of the word, it is not. So he's trying to draw a distinction that a government is a good thing, but we have other systems that are inherently bad, that are those evils, whereas government is sort of the good form of what those evils could be.
Yes, right. Yeah, so he kind of limits what he views as, legitimate government for sure.
Yes.
Which is pretty common, as we read in a previous season about different philosophers and their view of the relationship between the government and the governed and the religion and how church and state and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's similar to those arguments about what is good government or what is a tyrant.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And I think he's trying to similarly to define out what he means by the government, saying, well, it's not totalitarian. It's not for when people are just doing it for their own good, individual good, not for the common good. So what he's talking about, is something that's benevolent in essence.
Yeah. Then he makes an interesting argument. I think he's kind of getting into his sort of anti-democratic ideas, that it's not just a pure democracy, because he says, the denial of all real distinction between governor and governed is an error in politics analogous to that in philosophy or theology of denying all real distinction between creator and creature, God and the universe, which all the world knows is either pantheism or pure atheism, this supreme sophism. And this is an interesting argument.
Yes.
Because you hear so often, I think, especially in American politics, government of the people, for the people, by the people, that sort of idea. But he's saying, no, the people aren't really the government. You can't just say that there is one and the same thing, saying that the governed and the governed, the governed and the governors, the governed and the governors cannot 100% be the same thing. You have to have sort of a separate role for those two groups. Otherwise, you just have nothing. You just say everything's the same thing in the same way that you could say God is all of nature, and we're God, and I'm God, and everybody's God, which is, of course, a ridiculous concept. And I'm not too sure about that idea.
Yeah, I'm of the same mind as you. Is like, okay, I'd like to. We're gonna see how he elaborates on it, and I'm sure in future chapters. But yeah, I don't know if I'm that far along with going along with what he says, because especially in a republic, and that's always been my one big qualm about like the death penalty, because how can the government that's created by its representative people actually kill one of its own members? And so I don't see that separation, because what is the government except for the people that make it work? It's like Bill Barr, former attorney general, who mentioned, like there was some person asking him on Fox News or something, well, aren't you worried about Trump being a dictator or something? He says, well, the president acts through people.
Yeah.
And so, he's not going to be able to order crazy stuff because the people won't do it.
Yeah.
Whether he claims the authority or not, there's a certain practical element. And so I see a similar argument about, well, yeah, they could say it's the government separate, but the government in the United States is supposed to be working through its own people. So I don't know if I.
But I think at the same time, you can kind of make an argument in the opposite with the nature of a republic. Because, as opposed to a democracy, we're a republic, we are trusting other people to make the decisions for us. And you're saying you have a separate duty than we do.
Yeah,
we're not voting on all the laws. You are fundamentally taking on a different role as a governor rather than us as the governed. And so I think it is a tricky thing where it's the governors come from the pool of the governed. We don't have a separate class of society that can only be the governors. They're from the same type of people as us. And again, you can kind of complain about how it tends to be dynasties and the rich or whatever. Right. But fundamentally, they're of the same sort, but also different.
No, I get you. Yeah. I like that's a good argument.
It's an interesting distinction.
I was surprised by how emphatic he was about being loyal to that government.
Yes.
Where he's talking about treason is really a moral, a crime, a sin against God.
Yeah.
You're not just a crime against the sovereign, but it's a moral wrong, and therefore a sin against God. Which and he's talking about loyalty is the highest, noblest, and most generous of human virtues. Which I don't think I've heard any other philosopher really emphasize loyalty as the highest, noblest, most generous virtue.
It's very strange, but he's coming at it from the perspective of, government is kind of in its definition a good thing, and is something that has the right, because in the preceding paragraph, I think you're on page 14 here, but in that paragraph before that, he's talking about, power with right is not government, or power without right is not government. You have to have the right to have that power. It's not just brute force. And then he says...
I will say, I'm sorry, interrupting. I have the belief that loyalty is the cornerstone of a successful marriage. And so I think maybe that same analogy would work for a successul government. Yeah. Because
especially if you're taking this idea of the government as just a family writ large, essentially, or has its roots in the family, it would follow that same principle has to be the same. But he says, interestingly, he says, the government lies in the moral order, and politics is simply a branch of ethics. That branch which treats of the rights and duties of men and their public relations is distinguished from their rights and duties in their private relations. Yes. And that's interesting, too. You very, very rarely hear politics even mentioned in the same breath as ethics. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of the removal of morality from our laws and stuff like that. And we've talked about that ad nauseum in the past. But even going so far as to say that it is a branch of ethics is very interesting.
And I think he's 100% right. I think I've spoken about this before. Our legal system and our criminal laws are especially a form of ethics, and people don't recognize that. Yeah. They don't open their eyes to it. But I think he's right. Like even the atheistic left wingers, or maybe atheistic libertarians, to not always talk about how I hate leftists. But libertarians are just leftists who want to be free to do everything. To do all their licentiousness. Yeah. What was I even talking about? I completely lost my train of thought trying to pronounce licentiousness.
About how politics is ethics.
Yeah. And when they talk about, like they talk about, well, now topically, J.D. Vance and how he is condemning childless cat ladies. Thank God somebody said it. But anyway, the childless people are going to be the bane. They're going to destroy this world if we let them. But of course, they'll die off eventually because they don't have any children. But in any event, but they have their own ethics.
Yes.
They just express it as if they're not a moral system.
Yeah.
And he's right. I mean, and I've never really thought. I don't think I've ever thought about politics as expressing an ethical theory.
Yeah.
I mean,
we've talked about it a little bit in sort of, especially in terms of like the image and likeness of God, and how that's fundamental, and recognizing that there's dignity in people just because they are human. And that means that they're made in the image and likeness of God, and they have that inherent dignity. So in that way, it's absolutely encoding an ethical system.
Correct.
I think as it should, otherwise we wouldn't have a system at all.
But I think of politics as like a social science study. Like how do people gain power or assume power and power. But I don't know that I've ever expressed it. Oh, wait, this is just a subcategory of ethics, which it really is, isn't it?
It is. Because it's all about how we should treat one another. What is just? What is fundamentally just in a society? How we should
whether you want to call it just or not. But I mean, even the left uses the terms just.
Yes.
Social
absolutely.
justice.
Social justice. They use it more often than I think conservatives do to some degree.
Yeah.
And I think
poisoned the word. I think,
yes,
in
of course.
Some respects. Yeah.
But I think it is absolutely tied up in what is virtuous, really. Because I think when you're talking a lot about politics, you're using the language of virtue.
Yes. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Very fascinating. And then he also talks about kind of what you were saying a little bit. He says the American people have been chary, I think is how you pronounce that word, or wary. On the middle of page 14, chary, have been chary of the word loyalty, perhaps because they regard it as the correlative of royalty.
Yes.
But loyalty is rather the correlative of law, and is, in its essence, love and devotion to the sovereign authority, however constituted or wherever lodged. So it's not just a blind, whatever this royal monarch says. It's really a loyalty to what is right, what is just. Again, to go back to that language of virtue, because it is what is in the law, and the law encodes, what is good, or should encode what is good. Whether or not it's always successful, I think, is another question. But again, it's that fundamental ethical question at the heart of it.
And then he segues then into what I was talking about, but he makes a very compact and I think effective argument against wide-ranging and open civil libertarians. Where he says, freedom to follow in all things one's own will or inclination without any civil restraint is license, not liberty. That's really I was talking about the libertarians. But he's the way he expresses himself is so dense. Don't you think? I mean, there's the way he gets to the point. He doesn't have a wasted word in any of these paragraphs.
And it's so much tied to those few sentences in the end of that paragraph above, because he's talking again about loyalty, and I think that's at the root of what he thinks liberty versus license is. Because he says there's nothing great, generous, good, or heroic of which a truly loyal people are not capable, and nothing mean, base, cruel, brutal, criminal, detestable, not to be expected of a really disloyal people. So if you're not loyal to anything, of course you're going to go to your license, and you're going to go and do whatever you want. You're going to do these horrible, base, terrible things because you don't have that love and respect for the law or for a properly instituted government.
Or for each other.
Exactly. Because that's what a government is, of course, in his terms, is that, communion with, God through other people.
Yes.
Fascinating.
And then he talks about, well, if you're going to have it, if you're going to, the government be able to limit your civil liberties appropriately, he mentions, okay, well, when do we know they've gone too far? And he says, liberty is violated only when we are required to forego our own will or inclination by a power that has no right to make the requisition, which could be pretty expansive depending on how you go with it or not.
It really depends on how you define, what is the right to make the requisition.
Correct.
Because he says, we're bound to obedience as far as authority has right to govern, and we can never have the right to disobey a rightful command. Yeah. And so he doesn't really go into it here. I think he'll talk about it a little bit later. The next 3 chapters are all about the origin of government. I think that is the fundamental question in how government is created, is who has the right to have that power.
Well, he does acknowledge that. He says all turns then on the right of power or its legitimacy.
Yeah.
And that's, you can see how he's setting that up, is that we have to be loyal to a just government or an appropriate government is a moral duty. And so then he says, okay, it all turns on the right of the power or its legitimacy.
Because he says, he says of his argument, he says, this has no resemblance to the slavish doctrine of passive obedience and that the resistance to power can never be lawful. He says, if you have a tyrant who wants you to do things that are not right, then you do have an authority to use your power and rise against that tyrant. Again, he's a little unclear on what exactly makes a tyrant. He doesn't lay that out 100% here, but I think we'll talk about that a lot as the book goes on.
And he uses one of my favorite words recently, which was used in, I don't know if it's Tolkien's word, but it's in the Lord of the Rings, usurper.
Yes,
usurpers and destroyers from Treebeard. He mentions when he's angry. But I think usurper is a perfect name for the people in power in Washington. Many of them, they're just they've assumed control or power, but they don't have any legitimate authority over us.
And that's exactly what the definition of tyrant really is. If you go back, to how the Greeks and Romans defined it, because really, especially if you look at the Greeks, they didn't see tyrant as inherently like an evil person.
Right.
A tyrant could do good things. They're just someone who has used the system incorrectly. They've come to power outside of, of course, Athenian democracy had its flaws, but outside of Athenian democracy, if you came to power that way, you're a tyrant. And, a lot of the tyrants were very beneficial to the arts and beneficial to the people, but they were inherently did not have the right to rule. And of course, he's using it, I think, in a little bit more negative connotation, that the tyrant also has no right to rule and is doing bad things in what he's requiring of people. But yeah, very interesting. And then he says, there's a bunch of questions. Whence does government derive its right to govern? What is the origin and ground of sovereignty? And he says, I'm going to talk about that. That's the rest of the book. But yeah, very short chapter, only 6 pages, I think. No, 4 pages or 5 pages total. Yeah, it's great. So dense, but so thought-provoking.
With few words.
Yes, he really does. But yeah, it's an interesting question to keep considering. It's just the role, I think, because he's very spiritual, very traditionally Catholic, the role of God and of virtue and of ethics in politics, because I think we often see it as a very separate thing, and I don't think that we should.
Agreed.
Yes. Do you have any other thoughts? This is only 32 minutes, very short for our standards.
I could tell a couple more stories. I could do the long story. I give you the short story. I got to give you the long story.
Yeah, you got to bookend both this episode with the same story.
No, I can tell. Great book so far.
Yes.
I'm really happy with the selection. So good job picking this.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other closing thoughts from you?
I have none.
I
have none. I have no more thoughts.
You're out.
I'm out. I'm out of thoughts. But I'm sure I'll have some as we go into the next chapter next week.
Good.
All right. Well, this has been Season 9, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.